March 1945. Somewhere along the Rhine River in Germany, German reconnaissance officers study aerial photographs of American positions. What they see is alarming. Hundreds of tanks are massing south of Wesel. Artillery batteries are being positioned. Pontoon bridging equipment is being assembled. Radio intercepts confirm constant traffic between divisional headquarters and forward units. The sounds of heavy construction echo across the river at night. Trucks rumble through the darkness. Sergeants bark orders. The unmistakable clank and grind of armored vehicles fills the air. German commanders react exactly as any competent military officer would. They shift troops. They reinforce the sector opposite this massive American buildup. They prepare to meet what appears to be a major river crossing operation involving 2 full infantry divisions, approximately 40,000 American soldiers. What they cannot possibly know is that they are staring at empty air. The tanks are rubber. The artillery is inflatable. The construction sounds are recordings played through enormous speakers. The radio traffic is fiction, transmitted by operators trained to mimic the sending styles of real units. The 40,000 soldiers do not exist. There are barely 1,000 men on the ground, and their heaviest weapons are 50 caliber machine guns. When the real American 9th Army crosses the Rhine 10 miles north of this phantom force, they meet almost no resistance. German units that should have been defending the actual crossing point are instead deployed miles away, guarding against an invasion that was never coming. The soldiers cross virtually unopposed. Thousands, who might have died in a contested river assault, walk into Germany alive, and the men who saved them never fired a single shot. Because this unit did not fight with bullets, they fought with imagination, and in doing so, they may have saved more American lives than any conventional combat unit of comparable size in the entire European theater. The challenge facing American military planners in early 1944 was both tactical and psychological. The invasion of occupied Europe was coming. Everyone knew it. The Germans knew it. The question was not whether the Allies would attack, but where and when. And once the invasion began, how could American forces minimize casualties while maximizing strategic advantage? The losses in previous operations had been staggering. The landings in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy had demonstrated that amphibious assaults against defended positions produced horrific casualty rates. The Germans were masters of defensive warfare. Their fortifications were formidable. Their counterattacks were lethal. Every mile of territory gained came at a cost measured in American blood. But American planners had been watching their British allies with great interest. In October 1942, before the Second Battle of El Alamein in Egypt, British forces had executed something remarkable. Operation Bertram had used dummy tanks, fake supply depots, a phony water pipeline, and elaborate camouflage to convince German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel that the main British attack would come from the south, 2 days later than actually planned. Instead, General Bernard Montgomery struck from the north, achieving complete tactical surprise. Winston Churchill praised the operation in Parliament, declaring that by a marvelous system of camouflage, complete tactical surprise was achieved in the desert. The concept was simple but profound. In warfare, perception could be as powerful as reality. If you could make your enemy believe something false, you could defeat him without fighting. You could save your own soldiers by sending his soldiers to the wrong place. This was not merely clever tactics. It was recognition of a fundamental truth about military operations. Commanders do not respond to reality. They respond to what they believe reality to be. And if that belief can be manipulated, then so can their decisions. Deception in warfare was nothing new. Sun Tzu had written about it thousands of years earlier. George Washington had used elaborate ruses against the British during the Revolution. But the scale of modern warfare, with its aerial reconnaissance, signal, intelligence, and vast armies, seemed to make such tricks obsolete. How do you fool an enemy who can photograph your positions from the sky and intercept your radio communication? The British had demonstrated that the answer was not to avoid detection but to control what the enemy detected. Give them photographs to study. Give them radio traffic to intercept. Give them exactly what they expect to see and hear. Just make sure none of it is real. The question for American planners was whether this concept could be institutionalized, not as a one-time trick, but as a permanent capability, not borrowed from the British, but built from the ground up as a uniquely American unit. The answer came from 2 men working in London. Colonel Billy Harris was a West Point graduate and career Army officer, methodical and detail-oriented. Ralph Ingersoll was his opposite in almost every way. Before the war, Ingersoll had been the managing editor of The New Yorker, managing editor of Fortune, publisher of Time magazine, and founder of the New York newspaper PM. He was a wild idea man, a pie-in-the-sky thinker who saw possibilities where conventional military minds saw impossibilities. Together, they conceived something unprecedented in American military history, a unit designed from the ground up exclusively for deception, not soldiers who occasionally practiced trickery, but professionals whose entire mission was creating illusion, a traveling roadshow of fakery that could move up and down the front lines, impersonate real units to fool the enemy about American strength and intention. The concept was approved by the highest levels of Army command. On January 20th, 1944, the War Department officially activated the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops at Camp Forest, Tennessee. The unit would be commanded by Colonel Harry L. Reeder, a veteran officer with experience in both engineering and camouflage operations. The scope of what they were attempting had never been tried before. This would be the first mobile, multimedia, tactical deception unit in United States Army history, and its success or failure would be measured not in enemy casualties inflicted, but in American lives saved. The authorized strength of the 23rd was 82 officers and 1,023 enlisted men. In total, roughly 1,100 soldiers. But these would not be ordinary soldiers. The nature of their mission required an extraordinary collection of talents. Recruiters fanned out to art schools, advertising agencies, and theatrical companies. They searched for creative minds, problem solvers, people who could think visually and work with their hands. The notices that appeared on college bulletin boards were deliberately vague. A camouflage unit. Non-combat duty. An opportunity to serve using artistic skills. Bernie Bluestein was 19 years old when he spotted one such notice at his Cleveland Art College in March 1943. He was not exactly the fighter type, as he would later admit. The mysterious assignment seemed like an opportunity to serve without carrying a rifle into combat. He enlisted without knowing what he was getting into. What Bluestein and hundreds of other young artists discovered was that their supposedly safe assignment would put them closer to enemy guns than most infantry units ever got. And if the Germans ever figured out what they were really doing, the consequences would be brutal. The roster of men who passed through the 23rd reads like a future directory of American creative talent. Bill Blass would become one of the most celebrated fashion designers in American history, eventually dressing first ladies and winning dozens of industry awards. During the war, he could be found reading Vogue magazine in his foxhole between operations, sketching designs he would later sell to fashion houses in Rio de Janeiro and Buenos Aires. Ellsworth Kelly would become a pioneering figure in abstract expressionism, his paintings hanging in the world's most prestigious museums. He had specifically requested assignment to the camouflage unit while still an art student, sensing an opportunity to apply his visual training in unexpected ways. Art Kane would become a legendary photographer, famous for his iconic jazz portraits. Arthur Singer would create the illustrations for Birds of North America, one of the best-selling nature guides ever published. These men, and hundreds like them, brought skills that no military academy could teach. They understood color, form, perspective, and most importantly, they understood how to create convincing illusion. They thought like artists, which meant they thought about how viewers perceive images. They understood that a convincing fake was not simply an accurate copy, but something that satisfied the expectations of the observer. The unit attracted such concentrated creative talent that the 603rd Camouflage Engineer reportedly had one of the highest average intelligence quotients of any military formation. Their average IQ score was approximately 119, well above the population average. But more valuable than raw intelligence was their collective ability to solve problems through unconventional thinking. The 23rd was organized into 4 primary components, each responsible for a different element of the deception. The 603rd Camouflage Engineer Battalion was the largest unit, with 379 men. These were the visual illusionists. Their job was to create the physical props that would fool German aerial reconnaissance and ground observers, dummy tanks, fake artillery, phony supply dumps, entire phantom encampments complete with fake laundry hanging on clotheslines. The core of their equipment was the inflatable tank, designed by Fred Patton at the United States Rubber Company in Woonsocket, Rhode Island. These decoys were engineering marvels. Each one was modeled on the M4 Sherman, the workhorse tank of American armored forces, fully inflated. The dummy was 18 feet 4 inches long, 8 feet 3 inches wide, and 7 feet 9 inches to the top of the turret. It was constructed on a skeleton of inflatable rubber tubes, covered with a skin of rubberized canvas. The turret was a separate piece, inflated independently and attached to the body. A real Sherman tank weighed 32 tons. The rubber replica weighed 93 pounds. 4 men could lift one and carry it into position. From the air, or from a distance on the ground, it was virtually impossible to distinguish from the real thing. Manufacturing these decoys required a consortium of American companies. The United States Rubber Company handled primary production. Goodyear contributed. Even the Scranton Lace Curtain Manufacturing Company was brought in to help meet demand. Workers at these factories were told the products would be used as target practice dummies. 16-year-old Teresa Ricard earned 49 cents an hour at the Allied mill in Woonsocket, gluing and folding the big rubber tubes after school. She and her co-workers called them targets, never knowing their true purpose. It took approximately 20 minutes to inflate a single tank, using gasoline-powered air compressors. The 603rd eventually accumulated hundreds of these inflatable, along with dummy trucks, artillery pieces, jeeps, and even aircraft. But visual deception was only one element of the 23rd's capabilities. Creating convincing props was necessary but not sufficient. A field full of tanks that never moved, never made noise, and never communicated would quickly be identified as fake. The Germans were not stupid. They would notice if an entire armored division sat silently in place for days without any signs of normal military activity. The illusion had to be complete. It had to include everything a real military formation would produce: movement, sound, communications, the administrative bustle of thousands of men operating complex equipment. The 3,132nd Signal Service Company handled sonic deception. This was an entirely new concept in military operations. Their mission was to create the sounds of war without the actual war. The unit was organized under the direction of Colonel Hilton Rayleigh, a colorful figure who before the war had recruited Amelia Earhart for her 1928 transatlantic flight and helped launch her aviation career. For the sonic deception program, Rayleigh enlisted help from Bell Laboratories, legendary research facility responsible for so many technological breakthroughs. Bell Labs engineers traveled to Fort Knox, Kentucky, where they recorded authentic military sounds onto special discs. Tank engines starting and idling, vehicles moving over different terrain, troops marching, bridging equipment being assembled, officers giving orders, even soldiers cursing and complaining. The technical challenges were formidable. Simply driving a vehicle past a microphone created a Doppler effect that would immediately reveal the recording as fake. The solution was ingenious. Place the microphone at the center of a circle and drive the vehicles around it, keeping them equidistant from the recording equipment at all times. The resulting sound library allowed operators to mix custom soundtracks for any tactical scenario. If the deception called for an armored division moving into position, they could blend tank engine, truck convoys, troops marching, and construction noise into a convincing audio portrait. For playback, the 132nd used modified M301 tracks equipped with 500-pound speakers. The speakers could be stowed flat inside the vehicle bed, making the half-track look identical to thousands of others in the European theater. When deployed, the systems could project sound up to 15 miles under favorable conditions. The recordings were played on state-of-the-art wire recorders, the predecessor to magnetic tape, which could hold 30 minutes of audio on 2 miles of fine steel wire, moving at 5 feet per second. The effect was devastating to enemy intelligence. German soldiers in observation posts would hear the unmistakable sounds of American armor approaching through the night, the rumble of tank engines, the clatter of treads. Sergeants barking put out that cigarette, all of it completely fake. The Signal Company Special provided radio deception. These 296 men were trained in what they called spoof radio. Their job was to create entirely fictitious radio traffic networks that German signals intelligence would intercept and believe. Every radio operator has a distinctive sending style, what professionals call a telegraphic fist. The rhythm and timing of Morse code transmission is almost like a fingerprint. German intelligence officers knew this and tracked individual American operators. If an operator suddenly appeared in a new location, it could reveal troop movements. The Signal Company operators learned to mimic the sending styles of operators from real units. When those real units moved away, The spoof operators stayed behind, maintaining the fiction that the original unit was still in place, or they could create the impression that a unit existed where none had ever been. Finally, the 406th Combat Engineers provided security and construction support. These 168 men, under Captain George Reb, were trained as actual fighting soldiers. They guarded the perimeter of deception sites, ensuring no German patrols stumbled into areas where they might see 4 soldiers casually lifting a 40-ton tank. They also operated bulldozers to create fake tank tracks in the mud, adding another layer of authenticity to the visual deception. The combination of these 4 elements created something unprecedented, a completely integrated multimedia deception capability that could simulate the presence of up to 2 full divisions, roughly 30,000 men, all produced by barely 1,100 soldiers with rubber props, speakers, and radio sets. Training for the 23rd took place at multiple locations. After initial assembly at Camp Forest, Tennessee, the unit moved to Camp Pine in New York, now Fort Drum, for final preparation. The Army Experimental Station at Pine Camp became the center for sonic deception development, where Bell Lab's civilian advisors worked alongside military personnel to perfect the techniques. The men learned their craft through constant practice. They rehearsed inflating and positioning the decoys. They practiced creating convincing encampments with all the small details that made them believable: tent arrangements, vehicle spacing. The patterns of activity that German reconnaissance pilots would expect to see from a real military unit. They also learned the cardinal rule of working with inflatables. Never, under any circumstances, carry one across an open road or anywhere you might be observed. 2 men carrying a 40-ton tank would be an instant giveaway that would compromise the entire operation and likely get them killed. In early May 1944, the 23rd sailed for England, arriving just weeks before D-Day. They were based near Stratford-upon-Avon, Shakespeare's hometown, where they continued training and contributed to Operation Fortitude, the massive deception campaign designed to convince the Germans that the main Allied invasion would target Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. The first members of the 23rd to see action were 4 sergeants from the 603rd, who participated in the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944. They were assigned to set up Q lighting, a deceptive beach marker technique. But the equipment was never deployed as too many real lights made the deception unnecessary. Instead, the sergeants performed camouflage work on beach installations. 2 of these 4 men were wounded during the chaotic first day of the invasion. The full unit arrived in France in the weeks following D-Day, setting up operations near the Normandy beachhead. Their first major operation came in August 1944, during the siege of the French port city of Brest. Operation Brest marked a turning point for the 23rd. For the first time, they deployed all 4 elements of their deception capability simultaneously: visual, sonic, radio, and special effects, all working together to create a unified illusion. The situation at Brest was desperate. German General Hermann Bernhard Ramke commanded a garrison of approximately 38,000 troops, far more than American intelligence had estimated. 3 American infantry divisions from 8 corps had surrounded the city, but they lacked the strength to crack the defenses. The Americans needed Brest as a supply port. Every day of siege cost lives. The 23rd was ordered to inflate the apparent American strength. They would simulate 2 tank battalions from the 6th Armored Division, which had actually withdrawn from Brest 2 weeks earlier, plus a field artillery battalion. The goal was to convince Ramke that he faced overwhelming force and should surrender, or at minimum to draw German defensive attention away from the actual American assault point. The operation divided the 23rd into 3 task forces, each positioned at different points around the German perimeter. Dummy tanks were deployed within 500 yards of enemy positions. Sonic half-track operated for 3 consecutive nights, projecting the sounds of tanks approaching, harboring, and withdrawing. American troops more than a mile away reported hearing what they believed were real armored units assembling nearby. The visual deception was so convincing that American officers who climbed a church steeple in the nearby town of Milizac to observe the display could not tell the difference between the inflatable tanks and real ones from the 709th Tank Battalion that had been mixed in for added authenticity. German forces responded exactly as hoped. Intelligence later confirmed that between 20 and 50 additional 88mm anti-tank guns were repositioned to meet what the Germans believed was a major armored threat. The deception achieved one of its primary objectives: drawing German defensive resources to the flanks. Ramck ultimately did not surrender until late September, his fortress mentality immune to bluff. But Operation Brest taught the 23rd invaluable lessons about coordinating complex deceptions under combat conditions, and it earned them credibility with the combat commanders they would support for the rest of the war. Throughout the autumn of 1944, the 23rd moved eastward with the Allied advance, conducting operation after operation across France, Luxembourg and Belgium. In September, Operation Bettemberg became the longest deception the unit conducted during the war. General George Patton's Third Army was racing across France, but his rapid advance had opened a dangerous gap in the American line stretching more than 20 miles. If the Germans discovered this vulnerability and counterattacked, the consequences could be catastrophic. The 23rd was called in to plug the gap until reinforcements could arrive. For more than a week, barely 1,000 men held a front line that should have required an entire division. They deployed inflatable tanks, broadcast sounds of armored activity, and maintained constant spoof radio traffic, suggesting a much larger force was in position. Patton himself acknowledged the situation in a letter to his wife, writing that there was one rather bad spot in his line, but he did not think the Germans knew about it. The Ghost Army was hiding it by the grace of God and a lot of guts. Operations Officer Colonel Clifford Simonson later considered Bettemberg a turning point for the unit. It was their first operation executed fully professionally and correctly. The techniques they had practiced in training were now battle-proven. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, the 23rd conducted Operation Kodak, a radio-only deception that helped mask the movement of American forces being rushed to relieve the besieged town of Bastogne. German signals intelligence tracked what they believed were American units in certain positions, unaware that the radio traffic was fiction while the real units approached from entirely different directions. But the 23rd's crowning achievement came in March 1945 with Operation Viersen, their largest and most successful deception of the war. The American Ninth Army was preparing to cross the Rhine River into the German heartland. River crossings against defended positions were among the most dangerous operations in warfare. The attacking force was exposed during the crossing itself, vulnerable to artillery and small arms fire, while they had limited ability to maneuver or take cover. The Germans knew the Americans had to cross somewhere and would concentrate their forces to repel any assault. Historical examples from earlier in the war showed that opposed river crossings could produce staggering casualty rates. The question was where the hammer would fall. The Ninth Army planned to cross near Wesel using 16 corps, but to draw German attention away from the actual crossing point, they needed a convincing diversion. They needed a threat, so credible the German commanders would feel compelled to respond to it. They needed the 23rd. The mission parameters were staggering. The Ghost Army would simulate not one but two full infantry divisions, the 30th and 79th, representing approximately 40,000 soldiers. They would position this phantom force 10 miles south of the actual crossing point, near the German city of Viersen, and convince the enemy that this was where the main assault would come. Every element of the 23rd's capability was deployed. More than 600 inflatable vehicles were positioned along the river, including tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and even 5 liaison aircraft. Sonic trucks operated around the clock, broadcasting the sounds of troops arriving by day and heavy construction by night. The noise of pontoon bridge sections being assembled echoed across the water. Radio networks hummed with fictional traffic between divisional headquarters and subordinate units. The men of the 23rd did not merely create static displays. They created a living illusion. Dummy headquarters were established in local buildings, staffed by officers wearing the insignia of the divisions they were impersonating. Fake commanders and generals appeared at these posts. Ghost Army soldiers sewed counterfeit shoulder patches onto their uniforms and wore the appropriate unit markings. Then they took the deception into the local towns. The concept was called special effects or atmosphere. Ghost Army soldiers would visit cafes and bars in areas where German spies or sympathizers might be listening. They would discuss their units, their orders, and their expectations. All of it carefully scripted disinformation. They talked loudly about the upcoming crossing. They complained about their commanders. They speculated about how long the operation would take. Every conversation was designed to be overheard and reported to German intelligence. The attention to detail was obsessive. Artists in the 603rd had developed what they called poop sheets, densely packed pages documenting every distinguishing detail of the units they impersonated. bumper markings on vehicles, helmet insignia, road sign dimensions and colors. Even behavioral patterns and what songs particular units like to sing. German reconnaissance aircraft photographed the American positions and saw exactly what the 23rd wanted them to see: a massive build-up of armor and artillery. Preparations for a major river assault. German commanders responded predictably. They shifted forces south to meet the threat. Units that should have been defending the actual 9th Army crossing point near Wesel were redeployed to face the Phantom divisions near Viersen. When the real crossing began on March 23, 1945, the results exceeded all expectation. American forces met only disorganized resistance. The Germans had been caught looking the wrong way. Intelligence officers from the 30th Division later reported that the American attack came as a complete surprise to the enemy, with a consequent saving of American lives. Captured German documents confirmed the success. An enemy overlay of the American order of battle seized just before the attack showed the 79th Infantry Division positioned exactly where the 23rd had portrayed it. The 30th Division had been lost from German tracking altogether. The 9th Army crossed the Rhine virtually unopposed. Thousands of soldiers walked into Germany who might otherwise have died in a contested assault against prepared positions. Lieutenant General William H. Simpson, commanding the 9th Army, personally commended the 23rd for their contribution to the success of Operation Viersen. The Rhine crossing represented the ultimate validation of the Ghost Army concept. 1,000 soldiers with rubber tanks and speakers had accomplished what might have required tens of thousands of additional troops and potentially catastrophic casualties to achieve through direct assault. The operation illustrates a principle that military theorists would later study extensively: the asymmetry of deception warfare. The cost of creating a convincing illusion was a tiny fraction of the cost of creating the real thing, yet the effect on enemy behavior was identical. Consider the economics in stark terms. Building and fielding 2 actual infantry divisions required hundreds of thousands of tons of equipment, years of training, and the logistical capacity to move, feed, and arm approximately 40,000 men. The tanks alone would weigh thousands of tons. The ammunition, the fuel, the food, the medical supplies, the spare parts, all of it had to be manufactured, transported across the Atlantic Ocean, and moved to the front lines. The personnel costs were enormous. Training a combat-effective infantry division took many months. Replacing casualties required a constant flow of new soldiers. The Ghost Army achieved the same effect on German planning with 93-pound rubber tanks, speakers that could be mounted on a half-track, and radio operators sending fictional messages. The total weight of all the inflatable equipment used in Operation Viersen was a trivial fraction of what a single real Sherman tank weighed. The Germans had no way to distinguish between the illusion and reality. Their reconnaissance photographs showed tanks. Their listening posts heard engines and construction. Their signals intelligence intercepted divisional communication. Every indicator confirmed what the 23rd wanted them to believe. The principle extended beyond individual operations. Throughout their 11 months of combat operations, the 23rd conducted more than 20 deception campaigns across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. Each operation forced the Germans to react to phantom threats, diverting resources, attention, and defensive preparations away from actual American operations. The cumulative effect was incalculable. Every German soldier positioned against an inflatable tank was a soldier not positioned against a real American unit. Every artillery piece aimed at a phantom crossing point was a gun not aimed at actual troops. Military analysts studying the Ghost Army after the war reached a remarkable conclusion. A United States Army report declared that rarely, if ever, has there been a group of such a few men which had so great influence on the outcome of a major military campaign. The estimated number of American lives saved by Ghost Army operations ranges from 15,000 to 30,000. These figures are necessarily approximate. No one can say with certainty how many soldiers would have died in battle. That never happened because German defenders were in the wrong place. But the operational evidence is clear. Time after time, Ghost Army deceptions enabled American forces to achieve surprise, avoid prepared defenses, and accomplish objectives with minimal casualties. 3 Ghost Army soldiers were killed during combat operations. Approximately 30 were wounded. These casualties came from German artillery and small arms fire, as the 23rd regularly operated within a few hundred yards of enemy position. The men joked grimly that their life expectancy would be measured in minutes if the Germans ever figured out what they were really doing. An enemy patrol, stumbling into their positions, would find soldiers carrying 40-ton tanks. The explanation would be obvious, and the retribution would be swift and brutal. Their inflatable tanks drew real German fire, which was actually considered a measure of success. If the enemy was shooting at rubber, they believed it was real. During one operation, 24 of 35 dummy tanks were destroyed by German artillery. The 23rd counted this as a victory. Every shell fired at a fake tank was a shell not fired at American soldiers. The men accepted these risks, knowing that their contribution might never be recognized. The men who served in the 23rd went home at the end of the war and resumed their civilian lives. Bill Blass built his fashion empire. Ellsworth Kelly revolutionized American art. Art Kane became one of the most sought-after photographers in the country. Hundreds of others became professors, designers, illustrators, architects, and advertising executives, but they could not tell anyone what they had done. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was classified at the highest levels of military secrecy. The men were sworn to silence. They could not discuss their unit, their operations, or their methods with anyone, including their own families. For more than 50 years, one of the most remarkable stories of America, military innovation remained completely hidden from the public. Some veterans found creative ways to hint at their service without revealing details. One told his family he blew up tanks, technically true but completely misleading since the tanks he inflated were rubber. Others simply said nothing at all, carrying their secrets into old age. The army essentially forgot about the Ghost Army. Records were filed away and lost in archives. The institutional memory of this unprecedented unit faded until the late 1980s, when military researchers began rediscovering what had been accomplished. The full story did not become public until 1996, when the relevant documents were finally declassified. By then, most of the men who had served were elderly. Many had already died without ever receiving recognition for their contribution. The rediscovery sparked renewed interest in the Ghost Army story. Rick Beyer, a filmmaker and author, produced a PBS documentary titled The Ghost Army in 2013, bringing the unit's exploits to a wide audience for the first time. The Ghost Army Legacy Project, founded in 2016, began working to preserve the history and honor the veterans. In February 2022, President Joe Biden signed into law the Ghost Army Congressional Gold Medal Act. The Congressional Gold Medal is the highest civilian honor that Congress can bestow. The legislation recognized the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops and their sister unit, the 3,133rd Signal Service Company, which conducted sonic deception operations in Italy. On March 21, 2024, nearly 80 years after the war ended, 3 surviving members of the Ghost Army traveled to the United States Capitol to receive the honor. Bernie Bluestein, the young art student from Cleveland who had enlisted without knowing what he was getting into, was now 100 years old. Seymour Nussenbaum, also 100, had served with the 23rd through its major operation. John Kreisman was 99. Fewer than 10 of the original 1,100 Ghost Army soldiers remain alive today. House Speaker Mike Johnson opened the ceremony by reading from the declassified Army report. Rarely, if ever, has there been a group of such a few men which had so great an influence on the outcome of a major military campaign. Secretary of the Army Christine Wormuth noted that the Ghost Army's methods remain relevant to modern warfare. She told the veterans directly that even though technology has changed quite a bit since 1944, our modern techniques build on a lot of what the Ghost Army did, and we are still learning from your legacy. The psychological operations and information warfare communities of today's military trace their intellectual lineage directly to the 23rd. The Ghost Patch, the unofficial insignia of the unit, is still used informally by specialists in deception and influence operation. In November 2022, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was made honorary members of the United States Army Psychological Operations Regiment. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Now let me explain why this forgotten unit matters beyond military history. The Ghost Army represents something profound about the nature of conflict and human perception. Their success proved that wars are not won solely through superior firepower or larger armies. They are won in the minds of commanders, making decisions based on what they believe to be true. The German generals who shifted their forces to meet phantom divisions were not fools. They were experienced professionals acting on the best intelligence available to them. Their reconnaissance showed American tanks. Their listening posts heard American activity. Their signals intelligence confirmed American communication. Every source told the same story. The story was a lie, but it was a lie constructed with such skill, attention to detail, that it became indistinguishable from truth. This insight has implications far beyond the battlefield. In any domain where decisions are made based on perceived reality rather than actual reality, there is potential for the same asymmetry the Ghost Army exploited. The cost of creating a convincing illusion is almost always less than the cost of creating the real thing, but the effect on the perceiver is identical. Modern information warfare, cyber operations, and psychological campaigns all draw from principles the Ghost Army pioneered. The technology has changed. The human psychology being exploited has not. The Ghost Army also demonstrates that creativity has military value. The artists, designers, and theatrical professionals who made up the 23rd brought skills that no conventional military training could provide. They thought like their audience. They understood how to create believable scenes, how to sell an illusion, how to anticipate what observers would expect to see. The Army reported that the 603rd Camouflage Engineer had one of the highest average IQ scores of any unit in the military, approximately 119. But raw intelligence was not what made them effective. It was the application of creative problem-solving to military challenges. It was asking, what if we tried something that has never been done before? Today, the Ghost Army stands as a testament to American ingenuity during one of history's darkest hours. 1,000 artists, actors, and engineers went to war with rubber props and recording equipment. They operated within yards of enemy guns, knowing that if their deception failed, they would be slaughtered. 3 of them gave their lives. They saved an estimated 15,000 to 30,000 of their fellow soldiers without firing a shot in anger. They proved that in warfare, sometimes the mightiest weapon is imagination itself. The German commanders who deployed their forces against the Phantom divisions at Viersen believed they were making rational decisions based on solid intelligence. They were responding to a threat that appeared in every way to be real. Tanks on aerial photographs, sounds of armored movement, radio traffic between headquarters and forward units. They had no way of knowing that 4 soldiers could lift those tanks, that the sounds came from speakers, not engines, that the radio operators were actors reading from scripts. And because they believed the illusion, they lost the real battle before it even began. The conventional response to overwhelming enemy force is to build bigger armies, more powerful weapons, and greater destructive capability. The Ghost Army offered a different answer. Make the enemy believe you have what you lack. Make him guard against threats that do not exist. Make him waste his strength fighting shadows. It was warfare for the creative mind, and it worked. The rubber tanks that crossed Europe in 1944 and 1945 are long gone. None of the original inflatables survived the war. But their legacy endures in modern military doctrine, in the ongoing development of deception capabilities, and in the recognition finally granted to the men who proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon weighs 93 pounds and can be carried by 4 soldiers. That recognition, finally granted nearly 80 years after the fact, confirms what the operational record had always shown. The Ghost Army saved lives not by taking them, but by making the enemy believe in something that was never there. They won battles before they were fought. They protected American soldiers by making German soldiers look the wrong way. And they did it all with rubber, speakers, and imagination.